March 27, 1945. Oflag XIII-B, Hammelburg, Germany. Lieutenant Herndon Inge had learned to stop listening for sounds that weren't coming. That's what you do after a while in a prisoner of war camp. You stop expecting rescue planes. You stop listening for boots on the road that are always German, never American. You stop counting the days in a way that means anything, because meaning requires hope. And hope in a place like this costs more than most men can afford to keep spending. The wire was the world now. The cold was the world. The hunger that had settled into his bones since January and never fully left, that was the world. By late March 1945, nearly 1,300 American officers were behind that wire with him. Some had been there since January, men captured in the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, when Germany's last great offensive punched through the American lines in Belgium in December 1944. Officers from the 99th Division, the 106th, the 28th, men who had been at the wrong place at the wrong moment and had been living inside this fence ever since. Then there were the others, the ones who had arrived in early March, barely able to walk, who had done something that Inge thought about often in the weeks since. They had marched 340 miles, not in spring, in winter, on starvation rations, through snow and ice, 7 weeks mostly on foot, because the Russians were advancing from the east and the Germans were moving their prisoners ahead of the front. 1,290 men had walked out of a camp called Oflag XIII-B in Szubin, Poland, on January 21st, and arrived at Hammelburg on March 9th. What the men already in camp noticed first was not how beaten they looked, though they did look beaten. It was how they carried themselves. Straight backs, uniforms as clean as 7 weeks on the road allowed. Military courtesy observed without anyone ordering it. Officers who had marched halfway across Germany and arrived still refusing to let the road take something from them that wasn't the road's to take. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel John Waters. He had been a prisoner since Tunisia in February 1943, over 2 years. He had survived the North Africa campaign, survived the long, slow uncertainty of captivity, survived the 340-mile march from Poland that had broken men 20 years his junior. He was thin and worn and not in good physical condition, but he was present in the way that certain men are always present, regardless of what circumstances have done to them. He maintained order among the Americans in the camp the way a soldier does, quietly, consistently, without making speeches about it. If those men could walk 340 miles and still stand straight, Inge thought, then maybe there was still something worth holding on to. On the afternoon of March 27th, standing in the compound with nothing particular to do, he heard a sound he had trained himself not to trust. Engines. American engines. 50 miles to the west, a general had not forgotten they were there. George Patton had been fighting in Europe since 1942. He had landed in North Africa. He had commanded in Sicily. He had driven his Third Army across France at a pace that left German commanders unable to track where he was, let alone stop him. By late March 1945, the Third Army had crossed the Rhine, and the map of Germany was getting smaller every day. But Patton was not only thinking about the map. He had received intelligence that more than 1,000 American officers were being held in a prisoner of war camp near the Bavarian town of Hammelburg, 50 miles east of his current front lines. He knew the conditions: cold barracks, insufficient food, men running on whatever reserves they had left after months of captivity. He knew that some of them had walked 340 miles through a Polish and German winter to get there. He could have kept moving east.
Every general in the European theater had one priority in late March 1945: push forward, take ground, end the war. A 50-mile detour into enemy territory for a prisoner of war camp was not in any operational plan. Patton ordered the detour anyway. On the evening of March 25th, he summoned Captain Abraham Baum. Baum was 23 years old, born in the Bronx, a pattern maker's son who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor and fought his way from Normandy to the Rhine with the 4th Armored Division. He was compact and direct, the kind of officer who made decisions the way experienced pilots make adjustments, automatically, below the level of conscious thought. Patton had seen those qualities in enough officers to recognize them immediately. He gave Baum the orders personally. Take a task force. Penetrate 50 miles behind German lines. Find Oflag XIII-B. Bring those men home. Baum absorbed what he had just been told. He later recalled his first thought with the honesty that comes from men who have been through enough combat to stop pretending. "What the hell am I doing here?" He did not say that to Patton. He said, "Yes, sir," and went to work. 314 men, 57 vehicles, Sherman tanks, half-tracks, jeeps. Enough fuel to get there and back, calculated on the assumption that the route would hold. They rolled out on the evening of March 26th, moving under blackout in a column a mile long at 15 miles per hour, 15 maps for 57 vehicles, navigating through enemy-held Bavaria in the dark. They hit serious resistance near Aschaffenburg, pushed through, losing several vehicles. A German spotter plane found them mid-morning on the 27th and radioed their position ahead. From that moment, the element of surprise was gone. Every position between Task Force Baum and Hammelburg knew they were coming. Baum kept moving. By afternoon, they were close. A German anti-tank unit with 8 Panzerjäger vehicles, each armed with an 88mm gun, had positioned along the highway leading to the camp. They opened fire when Baum's column came into range. 1 Sherman destroyed, 1 light tank, 5 half-tracks, the half-tracks that were carrying the reserve fuel for the return trip. Baum's men destroyed 3 German vehicles before the unit pulled back. He absorbed the loss, assessed what remained, ran the numbers on fuel and distance, then ordered the column forward. The camp fence was 2 miles ahead. Inga heard the engines before he saw anything. The sound moved through the cold afternoon air from the north, low and steady, getting into his chest before his brain had finished deciding what it was. He stood completely still for a moment, the way you do when something happens that you have stopped building plans around. Then the man next to him heard it. Then the man next to him. The word moved through the compound like fire through dry grass, not spoken so much as passed, face to face, each one changing in the same sequence: disbelief, then something cautious, then something that cracked open despite every effort to hold it back. American tanks. The lead Sherman did not slow at the fence. It drove through it, not opened, not cut, driven through, the wire snapping and the posts going down under 30 tons of American steel moving at speed, as if the thing that had been the entire world for months was, in fact, nothing at all. The sound that came from the compound was not a cheer exactly, something rawer, something from a place men don't usually let anything out of. Officers who hadn't run in weeks ran toward the gap. Men who couldn't run walked as fast as they could. Some were crying without appearing to notice. Some were laughing. Some doing both. The soldiers on the tanks looked out at the crowd. They had been told to expect roughly 300 officers. They were looking at nearly 1,300, pressing from every direction, reaching up to shake hands, some just touching the metal of the tanks as if confirming the steel was real. Captain Baum climbed down and stood in the compound and did the arithmetic that combat officers do automatically. Vehicles remaining, fuel, men who could walk, distance to friendly lines, 200 seats, 1,300 men. Colonel Paul Good found Baum in the crowd. Good was the senior-ranking American officer in the camp. He had kept a list of every man's name through 4 months of captivity. He had marched 340 miles from Poland himself, arriving at Hammelburg in early March, thin, worn, but intact in the way that matters. He was the one who had held the chain of command together when there was nothing to command except the dignity of the men around him. He and Baum looked at the same numbers. The decision came quickly. Only field-grade officers, majors and above, were guaranteed a seat. Anyone else who could keep up on foot could try. Anyone who couldn't walk made their own choice. The vast majority could not walk 50 miles through enemy territory. They had barely been able to walk to the fence. They stayed. Good looked at the vehicles, looked at the men staying behind, men he had kept track of by name, men he had marched with, men he had been responsible for since January. He understood, with the clarity that certain moments produce, that what this column needed most was to move fast and not stop for anyone. He would not slow it down. He turned back toward the compound. He walked back into the camp voluntarily, while American tanks were still in the yard, while the gate was still open, so that Baum could leave without waiting. A colonel, returning to captivity on his own 2 feet because that was what the situation required. Baum watched him go and then turned his column west. On the other side of the compound, Waters had heard what was happening. He made his way toward the American vehicles, slowly, on feet that had carried him 340 miles and not fully recovered, and was asked by the German camp commander, General von Goeckel, to approach the Americans under a white flag. American tank fire had accidentally struck the Serbian section of the camp. The Serbian prisoners wore gray uniforms. In the confusion, gunners had not distinguished them from German soldiers. Goeckel needed it to stop. Waters agreed. He walked out with a German officer beside him, flag visible, moving toward the column. A German soldier at a distant outpost, one who had not been informed of the arrangement, fired. Waters went down with a bullet wound to the hip. He was carried back inside. He could not be moved. He stayed, too. At 8 o'clock that evening, Baum ordered the column out. Behind them, the men who remained watched the last American vehicle disappear into the dark. Inga stood in the yard. Not despair, not quite hope. Something in between. Someone had come. They had come 50 miles through enemy territory, knocked the fence down, taken everyone they could carry, and now they were gone. But they had been real. They had existed in that compound for 4 hours, and they had been completely, undeniably real. What happened next, on the road west, lasted until dawn. German soldiers from the infantry combat school had set their positions during the hours Task Force Baum spent at the camp. When the column came through near Holrich, the trap closed from every direction simultaneously. 4 Shermans were destroyed. The rest fell back to a hilltop and ran out of fuel, waiting for dawn. At first light on March 28th, the Germans attacked from every side at once. The fight lasted minutes. 32 men dead, 247 captured or missing. 35 made it home. Baum, shot in the groin, was brought back as a prisoner to the camp he had tried to liberate. He was placed in the camp hospital. The doctor who treated him was Serbian. This requires a moment of explanation. The Serbian prisoners at Oflag XIII-B had been there since 1941, 4 years. They were officers of the Yugoslav army, captured during Germany's invasion in the spring of that year, and they had been behind German wire since before America entered the war. 4 years of captivity, and their doctors had continued to practice medicine throughout, treating German soldiers when asked, treating Allied soldiers when the opportunity arose, treating whoever was placed in front of them with the same professional commitment, because medicine does not belong to any side of a war. Those doctors now had 2 new patients. Abraham Baum, who had driven 50 miles through enemy territory to liberate a camp and ended up a patient in its hospital. John Waters, who had been a prisoner for over 2 years and been shot under a white flag trying to prevent a mistake. The Serbian doctors worked on both men. They had no reason to. Their own war had been lost 4 years ago. Their own country was occupied. Their own situation was as uncertain as anyone else's in that camp. They worked anyway, because that is what doctors do. Waters survived each day. Baum lay in the bed next to him and counted 32 names that would not leave his head, regardless of what else he thought about. Nobody inside knew the number was 9. They counted mornings. The artillery in the distance grew louder. Inga had been listening to it for months and could hear the difference. The front was moving, coming toward them. The German guards felt it too. The regular soldiers had mostly gone already. What remained was Volkssturm, old men and teenagers in ill-fitting uniforms, carrying weapons they had been shown how to use only recently. Some disappeared during the night without announcement. The ones who stayed moved through their posts with a quietness that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with men who have already decided what they are going to do when the end arrives. The men in the compound found ways to pass the days. Some organized impromptu lectures. Some played cards with whatever they had. Some simply walked the perimeter of the compound, counting steps, keeping their legs from stiffening, keeping their minds from doing what minds do with too much silence and too little certainty. On the evening of April 5th, Inga stood in the yard and watched the last meaningful group of Volkssturm guards gather near the gate. He could not hear what they said to each other. He could read their faces well enough. That night, most of them walked away. On the morning of April 6th, the sound of engines came again. Not a raiding column, an army. The 14th Armored Division, in full force, in daylight, moving through Hammelburg with the weight of an Allied advance that had no real opposition left in this part of Bavaria. The handful of guards who remained looked at what was coming and put down their weapons. The 14th Armored drove through the gap that Task Force Baum had knocked open 9 days earlier and kept coming until the compound was full of American soldiers, and every German guard had been collected by the military intelligence units following close behind. No fighting, no last stand. Not a single casualty during the liberation itself, not one, on either side. The Serbian doctors prepared their patients for transport. Baum was helped onto a stretcher. Waters, who had survived 9 days in a camp hospital on the skill of men who had been prisoners since 1941, was carefully moved and loaded for evacuation. Both men were alive. Both were going home. Patton flew in himself. He walked through the camp and saw what it had been: the barracks, the wire, the hospital where 2 men he had sent on a mission had spent 9 days recovering from the consequences of it. He found Baum on a stretcher. He pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on him personally. The Army's second highest decoration, awarded on the spot in the hospital ward of a prisoner of war camp by the general who had sent the mission. Baum said thank you. The 32 names were already where they would stay for the rest of his life, in a place no medal reaches
and no ceremony changes. Patton visited Waters. What passed between them in that room was not recorded. Some things between men in those circumstances are not for the record. What Patton wrote afterward in his diary was honest. "I know of no error I made except of failing to send a larger combat command to Hammelburg. Not, I should not have tried, not, those men were too high a price, but I should have sent more." The mistake was the size of the force, not the decision to go. The men of Oflag XIII-B came home in the summer of 1945. Some needed months to recover their health. The men who had walked 340 miles from Poland never quite forgot what that felt like in their joints, the way extreme cold and exhaustion leave a memory in the body that outlasts the mind's ability to explain it. But every man who had stood in that compound on the afternoon of March 27th, every man who had heard the engines and watched the fence come down, carried one thing home that no amount of time fully took away: the knowledge that someone had come, not because it was safe, not because the numbers made sense, not because 50 miles behind German lines in March 1945 was any kind of reasonable military calculation, but because more than 1,000 American officers were behind a wire, and a general who could have kept moving east instead turned a task force around and sent it into the dark. It didn't work the way it was supposed to.
9 days later, the Army came back with enough. Herndon Inge went home to Alabama. He lived a long life. When people asked about the war, he talked about the cold and the wire and the men from Poland who marched 340 miles and arrived still standing straight. And he talked about March 27th. The afternoon an American tank drove through a fence, and more than 1,000 men who had stopped believing in rescue ran toward the gap. Patton's army did not leave its men behind, not without trying everything first. If your father or grandfather served in Patton's Third Army, or spent time as a prisoner of war in Europe, I'd like to hear about it in the comments below. And if these are the stories you come here for, subscribe. There are more of them.